Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Rebecca Lee. I'm the Executive Director of Vivli, a nonprofit that operates a global data sharing platform. I welcome you here today to our webinar. Today, we have really an excellent lineup of speakers focused on the convergence between machine learning and data sharing. Even though I'm moderating the session, I realize how much I really have to learn about this topic. And we at Vivli really have been receiving more and more proposals from data scientists, which really initiated the interest in this topic. And what I'd like to do is have our speakers today flip on their cameras and I can introduce them, and then we can move on to our first speaker today. So we have Dr. Ida Sim, who is an advisor, senior advisor at Vivli, and also a board member, as well as a co-founder, who will be starting us off. We also have Abby Greger and Dan Freshman, who will be joining us to look at the legal aspects, and they'll be joining us from Ropes and Gray. So what I'd like to do, and then we will round out this session with some Q&A. So we hope to keep this interactive. The Q&A will be questions, so you can put your questions as we go through, so you can will see those as they roll through. So please do ask questions as you have them. So I'll just hand this off to Ida, and we look forward to your questions. Thanks so much for joining us. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much. I'm very excited to share some thinking about machine learning. Here are some points of discussion I think we should all keep in mind as we go through this webinar. And we've left a lot of time for question and answer because that's always the fun part. So I'm going to start off with a very brief overview of machine learning and how it intersects with data sharing. You've probably all seen this. The world's most valuable resource is not oil anymore, but data. And data coupled with AI and machine learning really promises to change the world. I'm sure you've heard this ad nauseum, but it can be hard to get past the hype, right? What exactly is AI? What exactly is machine learning, or ML, as you may hear it? And what happens when ML meets data sharing? So let's start with AI. There are many definitions of artificial intelligence. They all boil down to this main idea. The AI is when a machine can perform tasks or otherwise behave as if it were intelligent. The machine doesn't actually have to be intelligent, whatever that means. There's a lot of philosophy around that one. But AI is AI when it does intelligent things. And what kinds of things are intelligent? Well, one is taking in data or input. It's thinking about that data or that input, and or taking action in the real world. AI is, of course, a huge business opportunity as companies like Google, Microsoft, IBM, they're all investing heavily in AI infrastructure. It's down in the bottom here, and all sorts of algorithms that provide common support for these building blocks of AI. So let's dive into what these building blocks are. First, for a machine to be intelligent, it must first ingest and understand some aspect of the world through data. So an example would be machine vision, right? Like recognizing your face so that you can log into your phone. Speech recognition, Alexa understanding your command. Natural language processing, or NLP, the ability of computers to read text. So for example, reading electronic health record notes and pulling out all the cases of cough. These all involve some version of what we call AI. Well, once you get data in, you want the machine to do something interesting about it. So the next step in intelligent behavior is processing or reasoning about data. For example, if you search for flights to Hawaii, Google's going to start showing you ads for swimwear. The ability to learn, this middle block here, is obviously a huge part of intelligence, and we'll come back to this later in our talk. A processing task that ties into taking action is planning, which is a really, really big and a classic part of AI. I have a robot vacuum cleaner, and I am very impressed that it maps my house and it plans the most efficient route to both vacuum and mop my floors. It is wonderful. Lastly, AI, where AI really wows, is an AI controlling actions in the real world. Some examples of this include deep fake videos, which I'm sure you've heard about, Siri telling you what your Google search results are. In robots, super cute robot dogs, those robots who go around the hospital delivering medications, and of course, self-driving Teslas. So these are intelligent behaviors that come under the broad term of AI, or artificial intelligence. They are made possible by powerful algorithms that run on platforms. You might have heard of TensorFlow, for example. And all these algorithms and platforms, they're hosted in the cloud, which is just really, really big machines that are really powerful in computation, in running computational processes. And these algorithms do take a lot of computational power, and that's why you have these common, cloud infrastructure running algorithms. And one of the most hyped type of AI algorithms, one of the most powerful right now, is machine learning, or ML. And so ML is used for many different AI applications, from machine vision to learning to autonomous vehicles. So I hope that clarifies sort of the difference in the relationship between AI and algorithms, a specific class of which is machine learning. So like the term AI, there are many definitions of machine learning. Here's one from the MIT Technology Review: computer algorithms that find and apply patterns in data. Now you look at that and you go, well, hey, statistics does that too. What's the big difference, right? Except maybe machine learning works with huge, huge amounts of data. How is this different from statistics? And you'd actually be right. ML is just another way to understand and draw inferences out of data. That's really all it is. Start with data, you come up with something that you can say about the data. And machine learning, which is in this purple bubble here, overlaps with statistics. It involves a lot of math. There's a lot of theory in it. It's also part of AI, as we discussed, and part of a broader discipline of computer science. It's really a mishmash of approaches and disciplines. And there's a tremendous amount of overlap, and that's really the only take-home message from this somewhat busy and colorful slide. ML has commonalities with traditional analytics, right, with statistics. It means also that ML is subject to the same pitfalls as traditional statistics. It's not anything special. And just because you use machine learning doesn't mean you somehow magically escape the problems of bias or confounding or the risk of interpreting things inappropriately. We can and should hold machine learning to the same expectations for scientific integrity as we do traditional analytics. It's really just another analytic method. It's like increasing our toolbox, basically. But machine learning does have some distinctive approaches that are different from sort of traditional statistics. And the three to know about are supervised learning, unsupervised learning, and reinforcement learning. These methods are widely used today in finance and marketing, science, video games, many, many other industries. A lot of our life right now is being affected by all three of these approaches to machine learning. So supervised learning works like this. Say you want to predict whether someone's using a stolen credit card. So you start off with billions of credit card transactions, and you label those transactions either as normal or as fraudulent based on findings from your fraud department. So you need some kind of gold standard or a ground truth, and you label the data. You'll hear that, one challenge in AI ML is the lack of data and the lack of labeled data. So you need to have the transactions labeled as normal or fraudulent based on some gold standard. And then what you do is you supervise the computer. You teach the computer the underlying pattern. These are the transactions that are normal. These are the ones that are fraudulent. Go learn the difference between them. Some methods for these you may have heard of: neural networks, deep learning, so that when a new transaction comes in, the computer can say, I recognize it. That's a normal one, or that's a fraudulent one. So that's supervised learning, when you have labeled data and you almost directly teach the computer, one pattern versus another. Unsupervised learning is different in that you don't teach the computer anything. You just give it lots of data. You go away, let the computer do its thing unsupervised. And so, the computer, in this example of billions of credit card transactions, you just let them find a pattern. And maybe for whatever reason, the computer sees that people who buy kombucha are very different from the people who don't, and can tell you how they're different. And then you can use these features to predict something you really weren't terribly interested in the first place, who are the computer purchasers, or maybe you are, right? But you don't go in with a hypothesis, you don't go in with labeled data. The third kind of machine learning approach, really getting a lot of interest, is reinforcement learning. Here it's for intelligent agents. You may have heard of that term. An intelligent agent are just programs that can act autonomously. They have their own goals, they have their own actions that they can take in the real world. They get feedback on it, and they're trying to get better at what they do. So an example would be a stock trading agent. It independently buys and sells, and then it sees how it does. It will take the results of those transactions along with massive amounts of other data, and it continually tweaks its own algorithm to reinforce better trades. Those of you who have kids will see, examples of all this kind of learning in our own children. So what does this all have to do with Vivli and clinical trial data sharing? About 12% of Vivli data requests fall into this category that's called other. It's actually it reflects a growing interest in applications of machine learning to participant level data. As you heard Rebecca saying, we're getting more and more interest, and more of them are about machine learning. So this webinar is introduced to the broader Vivli community, the promise and admittedly some concerns about machine learning. So this is how I think about what we're doing at Vivli. We're accelerating the generation of new findings, and new findings come from a combination of data, how that data is collected or the study design, and then how that data are analyzed. And this evidence equation is true for one study, or it's true for many studies pulled together. In a traditional data request, the individual participant level data, or the IPD, is combined with understanding the protocol and the data dictionary, and then we apply the standard statistical techniques we all know and love. These analyses should, of course, be appropriate to the study design, and then the findings fall along this hierarchy of evidence, this pyramid that we all know. So there's nothing new here, right? And the IPD from Vivli, we have over 5,900 trials now that people can request. 3.6 million participants. So a rich treasure trove. But you do need to understand the study design, and you should be facile in your analytics. So nothing new here. That's what we've been doing at Vivli. The only difference in a machine learning-based data request is a change in the analytic approach. So ML-based requests can ask the same questions as traditional requests. They use the same data. They need to understand the protocol and the data dictionary in just the same way. It's just that it uses machine learning instead of traditional statistics. So let's illustrate this by looking at two approved Vivli data requests. The first case study is on individualized prediction of treatment response to methotrexate in patients with rheumatoid arthritis. Now, if I just stop there, you wouldn't immediately think this is a machine learning request, right? Because you can easily do this study with traditional statistics, and this is a request from the Mayo Clinic. So this study team wants to identify which patients with early rheumatoid arthritis, or RA, will respond to methotrexate, which is somewhat toxic drug. Their hypothesis is that responders and non-responders are different in their socio-demographic, clinical, and serologic features. Okay, that's the hypothesis. And they think that if they can identify these features, then they can better predict who will respond and who won't. Okay. Now, clearly you can run your own study to do this, but a lot of this data has already been collected by other clinical trials. So what they want to do is to take that data and build a predictive model. And they're requested 5 trials over 11,000 participants. And obviously they have the protocol and the data dictionary through Vivli. And they want to apply machine learning to build this predictive model. And of course, you can use other techniques as well. But they're using machine learning. So here's how they might go about it. And I'm saying this for illustrative purposes. I'm not part of the study team. So one way they could go about it, aim one, is to identify clusters of patients based on rheumatoid arthritis disease activity scores. So usually when you hear the word cluster, it kind of suggests unsupervised learning. So here's one way they could do it, right? You take all that data, clean it up so that it's all, aligned. You just let the computer find clusters of features that differentiate patients of mild, moderate, or severe RA, right? It's kind of like the kombucha example. And the computer will identify which, or even if there are sociodemographic, clinical, or serologic features that sort of, fall out in these different groups of patients with varying disease activity. Now, the advantage of this approach is that you don't have to know, as the researcher here, which sociodemographic, clinical, or serologic features you're interested in. You don't even know, in fact, if these are important at all. Maybe the strongest predictor of RA disease happens to be the length of the patient's middle names. You don't know. You just throw the machine, the data at the machine, and it's unsupervised learning, and all sorts of patterns could come up. And I think part of the point here is that it will find something. There will be some clustering, and it may be a very tight cluster, maybe a very diffuse cluster, but here you need to have the subject matter expertise to interpret that finding and put it into context. So in AIM-2, the machine, the team wants to develop and validate an individualized predictive algorithm. Right? So now they want to take what they've learned and they want to predict for an individual patient whether or not they're going to respond to methotrexate. So one way to do this would be to do supervised learning. So you go into the data and you say, okay, who are the people who responded and who are the people who didn't respond? And let me see if I can supervise the machine to learn a pattern about those who respond versus those who don't respond. And I think the intent here is that maybe the team would learn something from AIM-1 around those who, if you subset the patients into different, disease activity based on what you find out from AIM-1, then you can be more individualized and more accurate in your prediction of who is a responder and who is not a responder, right? So this is a classic clinical question. Prediction is a classic clinical question. This team from Mayo just happens to propose using machine learning methods. It's otherwise doing the same solid research we would expect using traditional methods. So there are pros and there are cons. They might find something different. They have other biases and risk in analysis that are attendant to machine learning. But overall, you just have to be a good scientist. You have to be a good thinker about data, and you need to have subject matter expertise. You need to be careful of justifying the conclusions. Really nothing different there. Okay? So that's case one. The second case study is also a predictive algorithm. The objective here is to improve an existing commercial algorithm. Okay, test the prospects of expanding the skin intelligence algorithm for predicting response to treatment of several drugs for psoriatic patients with type 1 diabetes. So here, the team has requested only one trial with 49 participants. This is a study funded by the NIH and the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation. And this trial randomized 49 patients with newly diagnosed type 1 diabetes to receiving either elacept or placebo. And the main outcome here of interest was beta cell destruction. Okay. And what they are trying to do here is to find those type 1 diabetes patients who have ongoing beta cell destruction as opposed to those who receive elacept and maybe are protected, against ongoing beta cell destruction. They're trying to figure that out. Okay. So one approach would be supervised learning, right? Here are the people who were protected. Here are the people who not. And then let's find out what those type 1 diabetes patients are, how they're different between the two groups, and then take that learning, that model, that predictive model, and then integrate it with their existing predictive algorithm, their skin intelligence one, that for biological therapy response in patients with psoriasis and type 1 diabetes. Okay, so they have an existing predictive algorithm. They're trying to build another one on a smaller subset, a tighter, subset of patients in a question, and then they're going to merge those together. And the intent here is to expand a model and use that model to predict about patients who are not part of the study, right? On a whole other data set. And then the model becomes the finding. The model becomes the product of this work. Okay, whereas the other one, it was the finding that was the product of the work primarily. So that was a very quick tour of artificial intelligence and machine learning. Artificial intelligence, or AI, is a broad set of technologies for making machines understand data, to reason about that data, and to act in the real world like intelligent beings. Machine learning, ML, refers to algorithms that find and apply patterns in data. It's used to enable many different types of AI functions. ML, in the context of analyzing participant-level data, is just another set of tools to answer scientific questions we all have. ML analyses are subject to the same concerns about bias and confounders and inappropriate application and all those other things that good scientists ought to be concerned about. At Vivli, we've seen two general types of machine learning requests. One is to generate new findings using IPD from requested trials. That's the first case that I went over. And the other is to generate machine learning models, not for the findings themselves necessarily, but really to use that data to build models that can then be applied to predict or explain other data sets. Now, this latter use of IPD to produce ML models brings up, I think, some really interesting issues about intellectual property. And that's one of the things that our next speakers are going to talk about. And I hope that was useful, and I look forward to questions. So I think we're stopping. There we go. And we'll hand over to Dan and Abby.
Yes, thanks so much, Ida.
All right, thank you so much again, Ida, not only for a really helpful presentation, but for also, creating the perfect segue for us as we, now delve into some of the legal issues relating to machine learning, and also just more generally speaking about, the protections and really contours of how Vivli's, data use agreements, work in this context. See if I can go to the next slide here. Okay, let's see if I can move to the next slide. Here we go. Oh. Okay, so just a quick agenda to set things up here a little bit. So I think first we want to start at the 50,000 foot perspective and talk about what are some of the common data sharing issues, not only in a machine learning context, but generally, in, the industry and the communities that we work in when we're dealing with, data sharing amongst researchers, relating to clinical trial data and other really sort of proprietary sensitive fields like these. And then from there, we do want to go into some of the basic frameworks of Vivli's data use agreement, walk through how some of those terms operate from an intellectual property perspective, and then from there go into some of the few subtopics about intellectual property ownership, new data, other additional rights, and other obligations. And then finally talk about one specific legal issue that can be often a bit pervasive or a bit ubiquitous in data sharing agreements, which is the concept of contamination and how we can fight or deal with contamination from a legal perspective. And as an overall, disclaimer here, I think even though, people like myself and Abby, really enjoy digging into these data use agreements, we understand that for a lot of individuals, reading a contract can be like going to the dentist. So we're trying to make this, and apologies to any friends in the dental community, but we'll try to make this as high level, avoid as much, legal or lawyer speak as possible, and try to break down these pieces into really digestible portions. And accordingly, we don't really intend for this presentation to take the place of what's in the data use agreement. And certainly, it'll always be helpful or really imperative to review that agreement. But this is really more of a high level overview on the concept of machine learning.
Great. So moving into the key issues encountered in data sharing, as you might imagine, these issues center upon use rights and ownership primarily. For example, how is a data recipient allowed to use a data contributor's data set? Can they use the data set for any purpose? Are there limited purposes? If those purposes are limited, what are they? What's the scope? Who actually owns the data set? And something you might encounter frequently, who owns new data and other new IP that's generated from the use of the data set that might have a limited scope? What other restrictions or obligations might apply to the use of a data set? Is the data contributor allowed to publish its analysis of a data set? These issues are all addressed in the Vivli Data Use Agreement, and Dan will now walk through how those play out in the actual agreement in a little more detail.
Thanks, Abby. So a few basic primers here regarding the data use agreement, and apologies for a lot of the text here, but we'll do our best to again, break it down and really, simplified, easy to just terms. I think for any of the folks on this call that are not, again, a fan of reviewing contracts, I think that the biggest takeaway from a legal perspective to really gain from this presentation and this webinar is the idea that, under Vivli's data use agreement, when a data contributor is providing data to a data recipient, that data can only be used for limited specific purposes. These are limited use data sharing agreements. The agreements provide that data sets can only be used to perform specific research activities that are governed under a research plan that is attached to these agreements. Accordingly, the research plans need to be approved in advance by, Vivli's, review committee or by other, pre-approval means that are sometimes set out in these agreements. And really the white space or the opposite of that really means that effectively these data sets cannot be used for purposes outside of the research plan. That in and of itself would be, among many other things, a violation or breach of the data use agreement, and maybe terms for terminating that agreement. And it could lead to other legal liability as well. But, from the perspective of a data contributor, when a data contributor is providing data to a data recipient through the Vivli platform, that contributor is not providing the data for the recipient to use for any purpose carte blanche. It really needs to be constrained to what is in the research plan. Beyond that, a few other helpful ideas here as well. There are other strings attached, so to speak, with the use of data sets under the data use agreement. There are other, what we often view to be standard compliance with certain legal and regulatory requirements that a data recipient must abide by in using the data sets. So examples of these might be data privacy laws, HIPAA, ethical concerns or ethical obligations, IRB protocols, other things that are common to the use of data generally. And then beyond that, even if data is used within the confines of the scope of a research plan, the data can only be shared with certain prescribed third parties that are named in the research plan. Simply because a data recipient has the right to use a set of data for a certain purpose, that doesn't necessarily mean that use, permits the data recipient to use the data with any third party that they choose. There are, again, additional confines there. Finally, the ownership point is thankfully a relatively straightforward one. So that the question of who owns the data that is being transferred under these data use agreements, the data contributor will always retain ownership of that data, merely because a limited license is being granted to a data recipient does not equate to a transfer of ownership. So legal title or ownership, to the extent that exists for a data set, that remains with the data contributor. There's no transfer of ownership. Okay, so this next portion, we also wanted to discuss the idea of new data and IP. We understand that data recipients, such as machine learning companies or other institutions or organizations, that they may be doing very creative, brilliant, inventive things through the use of that data. whether it's building an algorithm or running certain assays or conducting other activities that may lead to these inventive steps or other really useful, new, important information or data. And we bucket that or think about that holistically as, new IP or new intellectual property. Under the data use agreements, the data recipients are going to retain ownership of the new IP or the new stuff that they invent. There are, however, some contours and restrictions to that. First of all, the data recipients need to inform Vivli of any new IP that is created, so therefore Vivli can notify the data contributor of that new IP, and we'll tell you why that matters a bit on the next slide. And then beyond that, data recipients are obligated to grant the data contributors, the people that originally gave the data, a non-exclusive license to any of that new intellectual property to use for certain limited purposes. So when we think about these data use agreements, it doesn't merely consist of a one-way sharing of data or a one-way grant of a license. There's an initial grant of a license to the data recipient to use, that data set for a certain limited purpose. And then subsequently, there is what we sometimes refer to as a grant back license, where the data recipient is also granting rights to the data contributor to use that new intellectual property for, again, certain limited purposes. And as I mentioned on the last slide, when any new IP is invented by a data recipient, the data recipient is obligated to inform Vivli of that new IP. That is particularly relevant because, well, let's say, for example, a data contributor doesn't merely want a non-exclusive license to the new intellectual property to use for limited purposes. Well, let's say they want an exclusive license. Exclusive meaning that, of course, that the data recipient can't grant the same license to another party under, again, that new intellectual property. In that case, the data contributor does receive on an ongoing basis an option to negotiate and obtain an exclusive, fee-bearing license under those new intellectual property rights to use for those same limited purposes. So there is an ongoing right to negotiate effectively under Vivli's data use agreements with respect to that new intellectual property. And further in this slide, we do describe some of the mechanics in which that negotiation process works. So the option can be negotiated or rather exercised within 180 days of the data contributor becoming aware of the new intellectual property. And then if the data contributor does exercise that option, then there's an additional 180-day negotiation period where the parties must negotiate in good faith for the terms of that exclusive license. Now, merely because it's an option to negotiate, that does not require the parties to come to terms on that exclusive license. There's merely an obligation to negotiate in good faith with one another. And as a result, if the parties aren't able to agree on the terms of an exclusive license of this sort with respect to the new intellectual property in question, then after those 180 days, the parties would be able to walk away from one another and there would be no license granted. So it's merely, again, an option to negotiate. A few other related requirements, and then I'll kick it over to Abby for the last few slides on contamination. Just really, really briefly, there are other, again, compliance-related requirements under the data use agreements. So to the extent that a data recipient is using, researchers or personnel who are then using the data, they do need to obtain written agreements with those researchers to confirm that new intellectual property rights are being assigned to the data recipient so that the licensing terms can take effect. And of course, those researchers must comply with the terms of Vivli's data use agreement. The same terms apply to other third parties, whether it's a contractor or consultant that has access to that data. There is a publication review process that's further outlined in the data use agreement that does provide the data contributor the right to comment and review any publications based on the study results or the data analysis that was conducted using the data contributors' data. And then finally, there is an obligation to make the results of the data analysis under the data use agreement available to the public within a certain period of time. And again, without getting into too many of the details, the goal of these data use agreements is to, promote public research and to get those results out to the public for the benefit of our greater community. So now I will kick it over to Abby to talk about some of the specific legal issues that may come up sometimes with these data use agreements, especially in a machine learning context.
Thanks, Dan. So we started the legal-centric discussion on data sharing by highlighting key IP issues that might arise in how the data use agreement addresses those issues. Another important construct, as Dan mentioned, is this idea of contamination. So contamination is the concept that the use of restricted information in a project is basically being used outside of the bounds of what it was originally authorized for. So as Dan talked about, there's a specific research plan. There are very specific uses outlined in a data use agreement. And the information that's been provided, the data that's been provided is now being used outside of that context. There are pretty serious consequences of contamination. For example, again, as Dan mentioned, you might lose rights to use that data completely. So even for the permitted uses, because the organization whose information has been misappropriated may terminate the entire contract with the organization who used the information inappropriately. There can also be civil liability, which is where the organization whose information has been misappropriated actually goes to court to seek damages to make them whole for that violation. Next slide. So taking a closer look at activities that could result in contamination versus those that likely would not. In our first example here, an organization receives a license under data or know-how for a limited purpose, and then its employees unintentionally use that data for other unauthorized purposes. And to kind of put this in context, in a more tangible example, think of a scientist who is working on multiple projects. They're working on a project on a Monday in a lab, and they have a scope of use for particular know-how. They're applying it to that project. The next day they go to work on a separate project, which is, somewhat related in terms of the topic, but is outside of the field of use of what they were applying on Monday. They then, because they learned it on Monday, apply it to the project on Tuesday, and that's outside of the scope of use for that know-how. So that's what we often see with know-how, for example, where there's basically a cross-pollination across different projects when you have the same people working on the same projects. And we'll talk about that in a couple of slides in terms of how to prevent contamination. Another example could be that after the expiration or termination of a data sharing agreement, an organization actually continues using that data, which it no longer has the right to do. Some activities that would likely not result in contamination include an organization generating new information or data from the use of the restricted information, and it subsequently uses that new information or data for other purposes. So again, in that context, they're not using the restricted information outside of the permitted scope of use. Another likely, non-contamination activity would be an independent development, where an organization develops new information or data independent of using the restricted information, and uses that information for other permitted purposes. Applying these principles to the Vivli data use agreement, contamination in data sharing may occur if a data set is used for a purpose outside of the approved research plan, as we mentioned earlier, or after the expiration or termination of the data use agreement. In practice, contamination is actually very difficult to fully remedy once it has occurred. This is because once restricted information is used in a project for unauthorized purposes, it may be very difficult to disentangle that information from the non-contaminated portion of the project. For example, as Ida was talking about algorithms previously, imagine building into your algorithm a contaminated data set outside of the permitted use, and mingling that information with other permitted sources of data. I'm sure Ida could weigh in, but I'm guessing it would be incredibly difficult to separate out the data once it's already gone in to the algorithm and the machine learning process. So, one of the most important points on contamination is preventing contamination from occurring in the first place. And the key question is, how do we do that? First and foremost, limiting access is critical. Access to any type of information that is restricted should be limited to a specific and well-defined set of individuals. So project managers should isolate who receives information from other closely related projects. So as we discussed in the scientist example, you'd want to keep people who are working on one project separate from related projects where there could be an inadvertent use of the same know-how or data. Practitioners should only request and access restricted information as absolutely necessary for research purposes. Lastly, organizations should limit commingling of restricted information with other information when possible. This can be done through setting up internal firewalls, for example, so that if you are aware that there could be overlap between two projects, or you have teams who are sort of related working on two projects, you actually set up internal firewalls on your systems to prevent access to other information that could contaminate your project. The second preventative measure that we often see and recommend is documentation. So basically all restricted information should be labeled as such, so that it's very, very clear to anyone using it who might not be familiar with the underlying agreement that something has a limited scope of use. Organizations should document all information, data, and other developments created during, before, and after the use of restricted information. And also be sure to clearly mark any restricted information as confidential to avoid accidental contamination by colleagues. Again, the assumption should be, even though we'd recommend people working on a project fully understand the limitations on use within that project, the assumption should be extra caution and assume that people who are working on it might not have the underlying context on permitted scope of use. The last preventative measure requires a thorough and ongoing review process, and this should just be built into the organization's best practices. An organization should carefully review any agreements regarding restricted usage, such as a data use agreement like Dan mentioned. Educate any individuals working on the project about the restrictions and make sure that they understand those restrictions before starting in on the project. And also maintain a written log of individuals who access restricted information. This means that if there is an instance of contamination, you can isolate it and prevent it from further tainting other projects within an organization and calling into question other research. So again, this is a high-level overview, but with these types of concepts in practice, your organization will be better suited for managing restricted information and making sure that you're able to comply with the data use agreements. And I'll turn it back over to Rebecca now for Q&A.
Thank you so much. If I could call back all the speakers, that would be wonderful. We do have some questions bubbling in. I have a question. If an ML model is built using the data, is that model now considered new IP? So I think that is directed at either Abby or Dan.
So the question is, if there is a new model that is created using the data, is that new IP? Is that correct?
Yeah, a new machine learning model built using the data. Would that model be considered new IP?
Yeah, Dan, I would think that that would be new IP. We can talk about the parameters of what it is, but if it is a model that's created using, essentially an amalgamation of other data inputs, that new process that has arisen from using that data, I believe would be considered new IP within the bounds of one of these data use agreements.
I would agree, Abby, and that is why the contamination term can sometimes be a bit illustrative, because certainly we understand that many data sets are often generated or used together to create a certain model or algorithm or other project, generally speaking, and it's highly likely that certainly one single data set was not the crux of, or really the integral, cause as to why that model was created. It was maybe 1% or lesser than 1% of what went into creating the model. So as a result, we can kind of think of it as tainted or contaminated in that way, because even though a model may have, used or relied upon a data set in a very de minimis or small manner, yes, and in this case, it would be considered new IP because the data set contributed to the creation of that model.
So similarly there, if I use the data not to build a machine learning model, but to build a regression model, I mean, abstractly, that's also new IP, right? That there's nothing different about it being a machine learning model versus a regression model. But I don't think we typically think of a regression model as being new IP. I mean, often we think of, because it's machine learning, it's something different, but it really isn't. So can you comment on that? Or maybe it is.
I think abstract is the key word there. I mean, I think when we look at IP, we typically think of these buckets of, patent rights, know-how, data. So it's almost as if, the method of doing the regression, and apologies, I'm not a statistician, but the method of actually getting to the regression is developed using the data. And it's almost that the method itself is the IP versus the resulting regression. Does that make sense?
Certainly a lot of nuances here. Mm-hmm.
I think sometimes, frequently in law school, we teach students for the first time about new intellectual property as a bundle of sticks. Certainly when we think about a model or another project broadly defined, that entire project is not just one piece of intellectual property. Instead, it often comprises many aspects or portions or little pieces of intellectual property that contribute to the whole. So it's possible that aspects of a model or regression can consist of new intellectual property, even though the whole piece we may not view as new intellectual property in and of itself, but there are aspects of it that are intellectual property at its more kind of granular, finite parts.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. And there is some comments in the chat that say some would argue that regression is a form of machine learning, and others say that they publish regression models in papers, so they're questioning if they're posting new IP in papers, and they argued that there's really no fundamental difference between the ML and the regression models, kind of similarly to what Ida is saying. So one question for Dan and Abby is, there are often multiple data contributors for a single machine learning request, or any request that we get, and how could these contributors exercise their individual rights to negotiate an exclusive license if there are multiple data contributors for a single request? And often that is the case. We have about a quarter of our requests that involve what we call multi-sponsors, so companies A, B, and C that are giving data for a single request. How does that work?
Yeah, so again, I can defer to Dan here on the actual mechanics of the agreements themselves, but I would think that each of the contributors has the right to negotiate for their own, license agreement with respect to their inputs into the process.
I think that's right, Abby, because the options to negotiate, is really dealt with on a new intellectual property by new intellectual property basis. So or almost on an invention by an invention basis. So certainly, I think each of the contributors with respect to a single piece of new intellectual property would be able to individually negotiate for that license, and certainly, it may become a bit of a logistical challenge for each, organization to sort of fight over that new piece of intellectual property. So it may involve some coordination, which I think, the Vivli team is sometimes sort of stuck as the middle person dealing with. But I think each data contributor, you're right, does have that individual right to negotiate.
Okay, thank you. And there is one question about, we've heard about blockchain and other NFTs, non-fungible tokens. So there's a question about any thoughts about alternative models of data ownership and verification using NFTs or other block-based strategies. Do these developments affect or intersect with these discussions that we're having today of AI and machine learning? So anyone want to take that one?
That's obviously a big topic. The approach in Vivli has been that we put the data into a secure virtual machine, in essence. So you need to have, access to this environment, and the data stays within that enclave, doesn't ever leave. And what you do in that enclave is not tracked. We don't have like an audit of all the transactions that happen on all the data within that secure machine. We've thought about that. That could allow us to maybe open up the data a little bit more, than a secure enclave, which is very much a lockdown. I think that just perhaps adds other complications. It doesn't necessarily solve some of the key problems. So we have not gone the blockchain route in that sense. I think if data were to be open, so for example, let's say that you didn't want to put your data into a secure enclave. You're a data contributor, data requester asks for your data. You're willing to just give it to them without putting it into a secure enclave, but you want to know what they've done with it. You want to control or have some sense of whether they're staying within the permission. There are technologies to do that. It's sort of more research technologies right now. So I think we could imagine where that might happen, where your transactions on a permitted data set are tracked in some way in an immutable audit trail. And then, then your transactions have to be within the bounds permitted within a data use agreement, right? And then that can be bound by secure contracts and all that kind of stuff that, is way out of what we can do. And I think part of the reason for this webinar also is to start discussing these topics so that, Vivli is a member-driven organization. And we need to make sure that everybody understands, what our approaches are, what the risks are. And so I think we've explored blockchain, but aren't very far down the line of really implementing it practically.
And Ida, you touched on an important point there, which is contracting around these types of things. The goal here is to get both sides comfortable with data contribution and the rights to use data. And, there is a form agreement that we serve up, but that doesn't mean that if you have particular needs or particular worries, that's not something that you build into your agreement. Again, the point is to make sure each side is comfortable with what's happening with the data here. And if there is something, a particular restriction that needs to be built in, or, more severe limitations on what can be done, publication review rights, these are the types of things that can be built into a contract to make sure that everybody's comfortable moving forward.
I think just to make one just general IP ownership and blockchain, it really is a cutting edge, just fascinating topic that I think, certainly the intellectual property and legal industries hasn't quite caught up to speed yet with the way in which, our society is growing at this, kind of really interesting breakneck pace, thinking outside of the box, So I think one way you can think about ownership in general is that ownership is effectively a right to exclude, right? It's the idea that this is mine and someone else can't do something with it, or that you can't have it. So likewise, building on Abby's point, contracting is often a way to develop those rights to exclude, saying, I can do this, but you can't do that, or vice versa. So there are certainly ways to get clever about it, or to kind of build these concepts in. But right now, certainly, again, the legal industry maybe isn't quite at the pace yet in which, our technological fields are evolving.
Thank you. We have a question on, are there specific instances of data methods becoming IP from an application to Vivli hosted data? We do not yet, but maybe someday we will. Data sets can only be used for limited purposes that are approved by the Vivli IRP. Question has come up. One question is, how limiting is that in real life, and have we been analyzing that? Ida, do you want to take that question? That we limit our purposes by the Vivli IRP or by the review board?
Well, so when you submit a data request, we ask that you, state your hypothesis, what data you're going to be looking at, which trials you're going to be looking at, which variables you're looking at, and then the statistical analysis plan. And it's reviewed by our independent review panel is the Wellcome Trust. And, there's actually quite a lot of good scientific feedback on that proposal. It's kind of like peer review. I think it actually is contributory to the quality of the science. Is that an appropriate question to ask of the data? Do you have enough data within the request to answer the question that you're interested in? So I think that sets the scope of the request. I think some of the requests have been very narrow, and some requests have been much broader. And I don't think any of them have come to data trolling. I think that was a concern, that people are just going to request a whole bunch of data and just say, give me the data, I want to troll the data. And I'm not aware that there have been requests like that. Rebecca, you'll know better. But I think most of the time that the requests are pretty, they're well formed, they're targeted, they're scoped appropriately to the scientific question, and then the review panel will review that and approve it on that basis. And I think that's the understanding upon which the scope is defined.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I really want to thank you, Ida, Dan, and Abby, for a robust discussion and a really thoughtful set of slides today. So if you have additional questions, please contact us. We will send the recording to those that have signed up and registered today, and we'll also circulate the slides. So thanks again for your attendance today, and for all three of you for presenting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.